The Present Age, Progress and Anarchy in Modern America by Robert Nisbet, 1988. Excerpts read by Jim Kelly. Chapter 2, The New Absolutism. Any framers of the U.S. Constitution who returned today would be quite shocked by the extent and depth of the power of the national state in American lives today, and by war and the gargantuan military. The most cursory reading of the Constitution itself tells us that, behind the labors which produced this document, lay an abiding fear, distrust, hatred of the kinds of political power identified with the government of George III, and with the centralized despotisms such as France, Prussia, and Russia on the continent. Add to reading of the Constitution even a scanning of the Federalist Papers, followed perhaps by a brief dipping into the annals of the Constitutional Convention, and there can be no doubt of what the framers most definitely did not want: a highly centralized, unitary, political leviathan. Much of the energy of political intellectuals, which, in this chapter, I shall call the political clerisy, has, since the New Deal, demonstrated that, although state authority has grown constantly heavier, reaching more and more recesses of life, there has not been any real compromise of liberty. In our politics, as well as in our military, the present age begins with the Great War and with Woodrow Wilson's powerful effect upon America. All men of military genius, wrote Tocqueville, are fond of centralization, and all men of centralizing genius are fond of war. The history of the United States is ample illustration of the general soundness of Tocqueville's principle. If we look at the presidents, starting with Andrew Jackson, who, if they have not actually relished and sought out war, have nevertheless taken to it and to the use of war powers rather more easily than others have, we must include some of our greatest presidents. In each of these presidents, there is a conspicuous readiness to turn to political centralization, bureaucracy, and the heaping up of powers, so far as possible, in the central government, even at the expense of a strictly read constitution. Woodrow Wilson is the master of them all, in respect to his union of strong instincts towards centralization and use of war powers. The blunt fact is that when, under Wilson, America was introduced to the war state in 1917, it was also introduced to what would later be known as the total or totalitarian state. There is this important point to add. The acts which transformed the laissez-faire entrepreneurial America into a total state for the duration were acts of Congress, not of a revolutionary minority as in Russia and Italy. And to repeat, there was not the slightest difficulty after the armistice in putting a terminal date to the various elements of the total state, though not all of the elements, railroads, unions, other industries, and associations, appeared to be happy in their return to freedom from the state. But with full understanding of the democratic institution of the Wilson war state, and of its equally democratic termination a couple of years later, it is entirely proper, nay, obligatory, to see this state as total, as a brief forerunner to the kinds of state that would be managerial states in the 30s, including those known as totalitarian. Just about everything in America that was susceptible of being brought under the direct rule of the federal government in Washington was brought under. It was all a great lesson, slowly but surely learned by those of nationalistic disposition, that it is far easier to promote the state's power when a trade-off in the form of economic and social goods is effected. Also, crises, whether actual war or something else, is a valuable means of accelerating political power. Wilson, whose feeling for the state was almost religious, sensed this. he found the time to give aid and sustenance to the class of political intellectuals just coming into existence, those for whom service to the central state in the interest of the people would become a creed. The national state never really went back to its pre-war laissez-faire identity. In dozens of laws passed and decrees issued, the 1920s proved to be anything but a return to the America of the first decade of the century. In national projects of reclamation, in agriculture, in educational assistance to the states and cities, in social work for the indigent, and in investigations of central planning possibilities, the federal government often came closer in the 20s to the Wilson War state than to anything that had preceded it in American history. The New Deal is a great watershed, not only in 20th century American history, but in our entire national history. In it, the mesmerizing idea of a national community was now at long last to be initiated in peacetime, as a measure to combat the evils of capitalism and its, quote, economic royalists, end quote. Without doubt, the idea of national community burns brightly in the American consciousness at the present time. Initiated by President Roosevelt, the idea has been nourished, watered, and tended in one degree or other by each succeeding president. Perhaps only under the camouflage of the rhetoric of freedom is the actual power of the state increased more easily than under the camouflage of the rhetoric of community. The greater despots of history, which is to say 20th century history, like Lenin, Mussolini, Hitler, Mayo, and Castro, have turned to both the rhetoric of freedom and the rhetoric of community. Here the Rousseauian vision in Western political thought plays a major role. Rousseau designed in his social contract, and even more, perhaps, in his discourse on political economy, the most powerful state to be found anywhere in political philosophy. There must be, wrote Rousseau, a social contract among the people. Quote, each of us puts his person and all his power in common under the supreme direction of the general will, and, in our corporate capacity, we receive each member as an indivisible part of the whole. End quote. True community for Rousseau is not anything arising out of kinship, religion, ethnicity, or language. True community lies only within the purview of the state consecrated to the virtue of citizens, to be sure, but the state one and for all. The general will to which Rousseau gives absolute sovereignty is the collective will, purged of all marks of purely individual wills, with their egoisms, avarices, and selfishnesses. From this, it is really but a short step for Rousseau to the idea of a civil religion, the note on which he ends his social contract. The civil religion, Rousseau insists, is to be limited to a few common articles which are, quote, not exactly dogmas, quote, being more nearly in the nature, he writes, of, quote, social sentiments, quote. While the sovereign can compel no one to believe them, quote, it can banish from the state whoever does not believe them. If anyone, after publicly recognizing these dogmas, behaves as if he does not believe them, let him be punished by death. He has committed the worst of all crimes, that of lying before the law. End quote. It remains for Rousseau only to point out that, while the sovereign general will is created by the social compact and is the emanation of the whole people, the ascertainment of this will on any given issue does not absolutely require such devices as voting and systems of representation. In fact, especially in larger states, these are undesirable. They would tend, Rousseau explains, to corrupt the purity of the general will by making appeal to the mere, quote, will of all, quote, with its undesirable attribute of majority opinion. Fortunately, Rousseau continues, elections, votes, and representatives are, quote, hardly ever necessary whether government is well-intentioned. For the rulers will know that the general will is always on the side which is most favorable to the public interest, that is to say, the most equitable, so that it is needful only to act justly to be certain of following the general will." And who ever heard of a government, from ancient imperial Egypt down to Stalin's Soviet Union, that did not believe it acted justly? Rousseau, as I have stressed, did not, in his estimation and in the estimation of countless worshippers since, thereby snatch freedom away from the individual. On the contrary, Rousseau guaranteed for man a higher form of freedom, that of participation in the being of the collective sovereign. And when this sovereign appears to be lowering its absolute power on the citizen's head, for whatever reason, this is only an act of, "forcing the citizen to be free." This is perhaps the single most important fact there is about Rousseau, the political thinker, the fact that makes him just as attractive to certain marginal conservatives as to all-out radicals. Rousseau transferred, as it were, grace from the body of the church to the body of the state based upon the social contract and the general will. His doctrine of general will was regarded in his day, as it is in ours, beyond the power of pure reason to understand, to assimilate. He could have said what St. Augustine said, in effect: "To understand, one must first believe. Have faith." Rousseau is the political mystic, rivaled in this respect only by Plato, whom Rousseau declared the greatest of his teachers. It is testimony to the religious element in Rousseau's political philosophy that he endowed his collective monolith of power in the pages of the social contract with a religion of its own, the civil religion, to which I have already referred. The general will is, of course, the Godhead. There was a certain unusual historical wisdom in Rousseau's act of creating a church for his state. State and church, although archenemies over long periods of time in the annals of civilization, have more in common than either does with the economic realm, the common butt of both religious and political condemnation for its alleged crassness and egoism. And it is a fact that, in the succession of power that forms the greatest single pageant in Western history, the state has succeeded the church in the detailed and minute custodianship of the individual. The state for a long time in history was obliged to wear the mantle of other, more respectable institutions. Thus the patriarchal state of yore, followed by the religious or divine right state. But since the 18th century, the state has walked on legs of its own, and in so many respects has taken over once ecclesiastical functions. There are respects, as I have suggested, in which the contemporary democratic state is like the totalitarian states of this century, in the number and scope of political laws governing the most intimate recesses of our lives, in the sheer comprehensiveness of political identity, role, law, and power in each state. But there is one large and sufficing difference between even the most bureaucratized and paternalistic of the democracies and the totalitarian states we have seen thus far in Russia and Germany foremost. In the totalitarian state, there is no pretense of free elections, free political association, and free choice of representatives in political office. Moreover, there is no instance, thus far at least, of a heavily bureaucratized, ordinance-saturated, democratic leviathan ever evolving into the total state as I have just described it. All totalitarian states we are familiar with are the consequences of armed revolution, are based upon their armies, and exist literally by command. There is no suggestion that, apart from military and party command, there is any kind of law that operates, certainly none of a common law character. But while democratic absolutism of the kind and extent we are now thoroughly familiar with poses no threat of evolution into a Soviet Union or Nazi Germany, it does not follow that it may not possibly grow almost insensibly by infinitesimal degrees into what is nothing less, for all practical purposes, than legal and administrative tyranny. There comes a time when no matter how much representation we as citizens have, laws of taxation and disposition of property, of choice of schooling, of private acts in the bedroom, of pornography and obscenity, of race, color, and sex, and of all else involved in the business of living, become burdensome to even the thickest skin. Freedom, whether in the sense of from or to, is not a virtue in itself. It is a virtue only when there goes with it personal privacy, autonomy in some degree, and creativeness to the limit of one's faculties. Democratic absolutism, chiefly in the manifestation of the thick, heavy bureaucracies we build today, can be as oppressive to the creative instinct, the curiosity itch, and the drive to explore as anything that exists more blatantly in the totalitarian state. Love freedom or hate it, there is a minimum without which there is not significant thought or action. Tocqueville, the first and even yet greatest theorist of democracy, was clear as he surveyed the European democracies coming into existence in the 1830s. He observed that democracy, more than any other type of state in history, introduces and refines and strengthens the power of the majority, the centralization of government, the leveling of social ranks in the name of individual equality, and the bureaucratization of society. For a long time, until the aftermath of World War I, the main Western ideologies were checks on the idea of the omnicompetent state. All these ideologies, essentially socialism, liberalism, and conservatism, had developed in consequence of two great events of the 18th century, the French Revolution and the Industrial Revolution. The nature and significance of all three traditional ideologies have been drastically changed during the decades since World War I. In the 1920s, the political intelligentsia grew appreciably in size and influence. The Wilson World War I state had left indelibly imprinted on a great many minds, academic foremost, perhaps, but legal and business minds too, the spectacle of intellectuals serving the state in the interests of moral betterment and economic reform. Where the church had been for so long the most widely accepted institutional base for reform of society, a constantly increasing number of social scientists, philosophers, and critics now, in the 1920s, put full emphasis on the national state. John Dewey, America's most respected and influential philosopher in the 20th century, put the stamp of approval on liberalism, in which the state would be the tireless champion of the people as against the varied factions of business, religion, and ordinary politics. The onset of the Great Depression at the beginning of the 1930s carried with it the greatest opportunity yet for the expansion and popularization of the political class. The almost instant hatred or disgust that fastened itself upon the business community made the hypertrophy of the state and its intellectual elites the easier. So did the presence of Herbert Hoover in the White House when the stock market crashed and then the pall of depression settled over the land. Hoover's reputation is, and doubtless always will be, that of a strict apostle of laissez-faire. He was anything but that. It was Roosevelt, though, who led all predecessors in the sheer number of intellectuals he attracted to Washington. What James Burnham has called the managerial revolution took place in America under Roosevelt, all the while, in different setting and with different results, the same managerial revolution was taking place in Europe. Burnham was struck in the 1930s by the ever-increasing power of management in the great corporations of America, almost always at the expense of the stockholders who, in theory, owned the corporation and possessed all the usual rights of control which normally go with ownership. Burnham saw the same type of managerial revolution taking place in Western governments. Political intellectuals and bureaucrats, one and all appointed, not elected, were taking over powers which once belonged to the people and their elected representatives. In Europe, this managerial revolution yielded up the totalitarian regimes of Russia, Italy, and Germany. They could be seen as extreme, deeply ideological manifestations of the revolution. But in other parts of Europe, France and Great Britain, for example, the managerial revolution had very much the same character and substance as it did in the New Deal America. Under the spur of the crisis of the World Depression, even the democracies were succumbing to the allure of a managerial class, thus, in their own way, adding to the crisis of democracy. I believe that the legal fraternity, especially in some of the more influential law schools, is rapidly becoming the most powerful wing or sector of the political clerisy in America. The idea of working directly through law and the courts in order to accomplish major changes in economy and social order, even in government itself, has its modern origin in Jeremy Bentham. Working through parliaments and congresses, Bentham believed, was a time-consuming, infinitely circuitous, and ultimately self-defeating approach to the good state. Bentham's solution was what he called the magistrate, that is, a man or tiny group of men acting more in the role of grand inquisitor than of any king, president, or legislative body, who, by the special nature of his exalted being, would always be in perfect synchronization with the will, that is, the real, the true, the general will of Rousseau, essentially of the whole people. The only way of overcoming the clutter and slowdown of representative institutions and of electorates, masses of incompetent citizens voting their feebly understood will, was through a great system of law, one based upon the principle of the greatest happiness for the largest number of people. This system of law would be personified, acted for, served, and above all, dominated by the magistrate. We are not likely to hear about a sovereign magistrate or the general will from our increasingly active, change-oriented legal clerisy. They appear to be quite satisfied with the present system of federal courts rising to the Supreme Court. Why not be satisfied? The Supreme Court is the single most glittering prize to be had in America for the activism, reform, or revolution-seized political mentality. We have learned over the past several decades, most resplendently in the Warren Court, how great, far-reaching changes can be effected by a majority of the Supreme Court without having to go through the channels set up and favored by the framers, that is, the legislative and the executive working together. To return to the present age, law, especially the law of the entire nation, federal law, presents itself as the most potent force for social change now imaginable. Inevitably, therefore, the attention of the eager, impatient, and activist among humanitarians and reconstructionists is already being turned from the presidency and the Congress, and conspicuously the merely state-level political offices, to the federal judiciary with its grand prize of the Chief Justiceship of the United States. Irrespective of all that, the present fact is that federal law, the federal courts, and above all the Supreme Court offer a challenge to eager spirits of the political clerisy that was not possible a generation or two ago when virtually all law practiced was at the local and state level. Law is, as Bentham saw brilliantly, the most egalitarian of all institutions in present society, and, as Tocqueville foresaw, the quest for equality would be the most consuming of all quests in the future. Given the vital place of the Supreme Court in this respect, we may expect to see nominations of justices by the executive branch henceforth subjected to ever more bitter confirmation fights in the Senate. In politics, the best of all known reinforcements of an ideological position is a philosophy of history. It has the effect of making your particular goal seem a part of the constitution of mankind, of the movement of the stars in their courses. Karl Marx learned this, and what he learned has had great influence on other political and social causes, including that today of the centralized national state. He had a philosophy of history in which personal craving was hugely reinforced by the vision of all history as class struggle, which stayed a moral step above the preceding one. A similar philosophy of history in stages contributes to the democratic absolutism and its prosperity. First the family, then religion, then the local community and cooperative. These, like the family itself, served human beings well in their time, but, the argument goes, their time is now gone, leaving the political state as the lineal, progressive replacement of the family, church, and traditional local community. The highest form of community is today, the argument continues, the political community, that is, the state suitably equipped with largesse in every form. It is not enough to say that the national state is simply a good community. It must be presented as the only possible community in the late 20th century, the single form of community that has emerged from the whole historical process and is thus, whether we recognize it or not, an inevitable stage in the evolution of human society. We must be able to sing with our hearts, the state is necessary and the inexorable outcome of Western history. All other forms of association, intermediate to man and the state, are at best sentimental reminders of the past, the dead, soon to be forgotten past. The great advantage of a philosophy of history, or theory of social development, however subjective and fanciful, is that the holder of the philosophy or theory is then able to point out confidently those elements of the present which are progressive, modern, and functional, as contrasted with other elements of the present which are obsolete, archaic, and reactionary. These latter elements are survivals of some earlier, now outmoded stage of human development, and no matter how attractive, how desirable, how seemingly efficient they are, like the family, church, and local community, like the free market, the private sector, and the voluntary association, they must be sternly repudiated. Repudiated in favor of the national, democratic, central people's state, hereinafter known as the true family, community, and wagon train, all courtesy of Governor Cuomo. This centralization, nationalist administration of government, and within this the presidency over Congress and the judiciary, and a generally unitary type of society are all to be preferred to pluralism, decentralization, particularism, and the private sector, because these last are mere reminders of the past, quote, communities of memory, quote, and the stuff of nostalgic romance. Accompanying the rage to political power in our age is the relentless march of royalism in the federal government. We see this in the presidency perhaps foremost, and I shall restrict myself for the most part to this office. But it would be negligent to overlook the trail of royalism in other departments of government also. In the Supreme Court, where, as I have just emphasized, the temptation to make law instead of merely interpreting becomes ever stronger. In the Congress, especially the Senate, where more and more recourse is had to televised performances of Senate committees sitting inquisitorially over individuals, hailed commandingly by subpoena to come in front of it and be interrogated, often sharply, before the many millions of the television audience, descendants perhaps of those who used to enjoy public hangings. Everywhere in the federal courts, in the halls and offices of Congress, in the White House, the mantle of luxury shines, a luxury of appointments, architecture, and style that one cannot often find in Europe anymore. This is particularly noticeable in the presidency. Basic to the clerisy strategy of magnifying the presidency in the eyes of the people is the parallel work of denigrating Congress and the departments. It is nearly instinctual in the political clerisy, and this holds true whether the administration is Republican or Democrat, to portray the president as the elected representative of the entire people, quote, the people, quote, as it is commonly put, with congressmen portrayed like mayors and city councilmen, mere representatives of wards, sections, and districts, thus a cracked mirror of the people. This is not, of course, the way the framers of the Constitution saw the ideal of American government. Ben Franklin is said to have replied, when an outsider asked him which was being affected by the Constitutional Convention, a republic or a monarchy, quote, "A republic if you can keep it," quote. Franklin's answer would, no doubt, be the same today were he on the scene, but the words might be uttered with somewhat less confidence or optimism. During the past half-century, we have seen the spirit of royalism rise considerably. National security is, like raison d'etat, a wonderful umbrella for extensions of the presidential royal power. Whether the president personally, consciously participates in these extensions in domestic and foreign matters is just as hard to discover as ever it was when a Henry VIII or Louis XIV was involved. For the vast White House power is wielded today by a score of loyal, faithful, personal retainers dedicated to protection of the royal presence and largely out of reach of legislative bodies. Government of laws and offices threatens, thus, to be supplanted by government of personal retainers, of courtiers, one and all thrilled at the work of guarding, when necessary, the government and the people from their duly elected, constitutionally vested representatives. To shield, protect, conceal, dissemble for the president is now high among the responsibilities of the several hundred politiques who fill the White House and adjoining buildings as staff. This began in the Kennedy administration. There, the gravest offense any one of the protecting aides could be found guilty of was failing to absorb the possible blame to the president created by his own actions or words. The president is never wrong. If he appears to be wrong in the eyes of the press and people, someone in the White House curia or elite guard has failed in his job by not instantly absorbing full responsibility. Such treatment may be proper occasionally for traditional heads of state, whether kings, emperors, or presidents, who by office and tradition must be above the fray at all times,